The afternoon sun poured down over the city of Pittsburgh, heating the sidewalks until they shimmered and making every glass window along the street gleam like a mirror. The low hum of traffic, distant sirens, and occasional laughter wove together into the usual rhythm of city life. The smell of fresh bagels from the corner bakery mixed with the faint scent of summer flowers blooming in front yards and public planters. It was the kind of afternoon that made people slow their pace, take off their jackets, and breathe in the warmth of July. Linda Prescott walked along the shaded side of Birchwood Avenue, her steps calm and steady as she passed by familiar homes and trees she knew by heart. She was dressed in a sleeveless pale blue blouse, neatly tucked into a tan skirt that fell just past her knees, and a pair of flats that had clearly seen many long days of community work. Around her neck hung a silver chain with a small dove-shaped pendant, a gift from a woman she once helped, and one she wore every day as a quiet symbol of grace and peace. Linda had just left the community center 2 blocks away, where she'd spent the morning meeting with a group of women transitioning back into society after incarceration. As always, the work was hard, personal, and deeply emotional, but fulfilling. One woman had hugged her tightly today, whispering through tears, "You're the only one who treated me like a human being." That stuck with her as she made her way home. She passed the old bus stop on the corner, waved at Mrs. Halpern sitting on her porch swing, and paused briefly to admire a row of bright yellow lilies blooming by a mailbox. The sun touched her hair, chestnut brown with threads of silver, catching just enough light to give her presence a quiet radiance. Linda wasn't flashy, and she never raised her voice, but people noticed her. She carried herself with the kind of quiet strength that came from years of being overlooked and still standing tall. For most of her adult life, Linda had supported her husband Ethan through his steady rise in the bureau. She understood the pressures of public life, the weight of reputation, and the importance of restraint. Ethan was now the deputy director of the FBI in Pennsylvania, a man respected for his integrity and feared for his precision. But in their home, he was simply her husband. They talked about books, shared tea before bed, and protected each other from the heaviness of the outside world. As Linda approached their brick house with the white shutters and tall oak in front, she felt the familiar comfort of home rise in her chest. She reached into her tote bag for her keys, already thinking about what to make for dinner, when something strange pulled her out of that calm. A low rumble, tires against pavement, too fast. Her eyes shifted toward the sound just in time to see 2 patrol cars with flashing red and blue lights screech to a halt right in front of her home. The moment froze. The door to one car swung open hard, and 2 officers stepped out with purpose in their stride. Linda blinked, instinctively pulling her bag closer and stepping back onto the sidewalk. A heavy feeling crept into her chest. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. The taller officer stepped forward, his posture rigid and his face unreadable. He looked to be in his early 40s, with a squared jaw and eyes that didn't blink much. His name tag read T. Barnes. The younger one followed a few steps behind, a bit more hesitant, his hand resting awkwardly near his belt. His name was N. Miller. Linda glanced between them, searching their faces for any clue of what was going on. "Can I help you, officers?" she asked, her voice calm, but clearly laced with confusion. Barnes didn't return the courtesy. Instead, he barked out, "We received a report of suspicious materials linked to this address. We're here to conduct a search of the premises." Linda's eyebrows drew together. "Suspicious materials?" she repeated, genuinely puzzled. "What kind of report? And who filed it?" Barnes didn't answer the question. He shifted his stance and said, "We're not at liberty to disclose that information, ma'am. We need to enter your home immediately." The tone in his voice was sharp, official, and cold. Linda straightened her shoulders slightly. She wasn't angry yet, but she knew her rights. "I understand you're doing your job, Officer Barnes, but unless you have a warrant or probable cause, I'm going to have to ask you to wait until my husband arrives. He's the deputy director of the FBI here in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure he can help clarify whatever this is." For a second, the younger Officer Miller seemed to hesitate, glancing over at his partner with a flicker of uncertainty. But Barnes didn't flinch. His jaw tightened. "With all due respect, ma'am," he said, the phrase sounding more like a formality than sincerity, "this is not about who your husband is. We have reason to believe this property may contain materials connected to an ongoing investigation." Linda didn't move from her spot. "Then I'd like to see the warrant." That was when the shift happened. Barnes took a half-step closer, his eyes narrowing. "We can get one," he said flatly, "but we're not waiting." And just like that, he brushed past her shoulder, stepping through the front door without consent. Linda turned sharply, stunned. "Excuse me, you can't just—" Her protest was cut off as Officer Miller, looking visibly uncomfortable, followed his partner inside. She stood frozen on the porch, heart hammering, every nerve in her body screaming that this wasn't just wrong, it was personal. She'd seen this kind of misuse of power before, but never inside her own home. The word suspicious materials rang hollow in her mind. She had nothing to hide, nothing to fear. But the way Barnes had looked at her, cold, dismissive, calculated, made something deeper settle in her stomach. This wasn't just a mistake. It felt deliberate. What she didn't know, not yet, was that months earlier, Officer Barnes had been quietly disciplined for using excessive force during a home search in Wilkinsburg. Ethan Prescott had signed off on the warning, insisting the Bureau take internal conduct seriously. Barnes hadn't forgotten. When a vague, anonymous tip surfaced, suggesting someone from Linda's women's reentry program might have dropped off sensitive documents at her residence, Barnes jumped at the chance. He submitted a thin incident report and didn't wait for approval. It wasn't about evidence, it was about sending a message. And now he was inside, rifling through drawers, under the illusion that power excused everything. Inside the house, the sound of drawers being yanked open, boxes dropped, and heavy boots thudding against hardwood floors filled the quiet space that once felt safe. The Prescott home had always been a place of calm. Book-lined shelves, framed family photos, fresh flowers by the window. But now it felt like someone had taken a hammer to glass, shattering the peace into sharp, irretrievable pieces. Officer Barnes moved with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. He opened cabinets, pulled books from shelves, and tossed papers onto the floor as if any of it might magically produce something incriminating. Officer Miller, meanwhile, lingered near the front hallway, watching silently, his movements slower and more hesitant. He looked like someone trying to convince himself he was doing the right thing, but failing miserably. In the living room, Barnes flipped over the coffee table with one swift motion. The sound of glass hitting wood rang through the house. Several framed photos, a picture of Linda and Ethan at their anniversary, a photo of her holding a newborn niece, clattered to the ground. Linda watched from the threshold, frozen, gripping the strap of her tote bag so tightly her fingers began to cramp. Her knuckles turned white. Her eyes scanned the mess, trying to keep track of what was being touched, what was being broken, what was being taken from her without consent. She wanted to shout, to demand they stop, but her instincts told her to stay calm. That if she raised her voice, it could be twisted into defiance, and defiance into threat. And she knew all too well how quickly those labels could be used against people like her, especially black women who dared to show emotion in moments of injustice. Barnes moved into the dining room and began opening drawers from the sideboard, tossing old napkins, dinner candles, and folded holiday cards to the floor like trash. He reached into a locked drawer and didn't hesitate to use a small, flat tool from his belt to pop it open. Inside were legal documents, most related to the foundation Linda managed, but he barely glanced at them before scattering them across the table, muttering under his breath, "We'll see what's hiding in here." At one point, he held up a single folder and stared at it for a beat longer than the others. Then he tucked it under his arm. Linda saw it and immediately knew. Those were her volunteer background check records, confidential files submitted by the women she worked with, entrusted to her care. She opened her mouth to speak, but bit her tongue. She'd have to document this, all of it. Her heart pounded not just from fear, but from fury. She took a shaky breath and stepped one foot into the hallway. "Officer Barnes," she said, her voice still steady despite the storm inside her. "You are going through protected files. These are private. Some of these women are under court orders." Barnes didn't turn around. "Then maybe you should have kept them somewhere legal," he snapped, his voice filled with disdain. That was when Miller finally spoke up, barely above a whisper. "Troy, maybe we should slow down," he said, not meeting Linda's eyes. Barnes shot him a glare so sharp it could have cut steel. "Don't start that now," he growled. Linda locked eyes with Miller for a split second, and in that short glance, she saw the truth. He knew this was wrong. He was just too scared to stop it. She held that look a moment longer, then backed into the entryway again, her body trembling as she pulled out her phone and quietly opened the voice recorder app. If no one else was going to document this, she would. The noise continued for another 10 minutes. Then Barnes headed upstairs without a word. Linda remained downstairs alone, surrounded by overturned furniture and scattered pieces of her life. The silence between crashes rang louder than any siren. And somewhere, under the noise and shame, she could feel the weight of something bigger pressing into the walls. This wasn't just an unlawful search. This was targeted. And whoever sent Barnes here knew exactly what they wanted to destroy. Outside, a quiet tension had begun to build on the sidewalk. At first, it was just Mrs. Halpern, still on her porch swing, her eyes wide behind thick glasses as she watched the 2 police cruisers and the flurry of movement inside the Prescott home. But soon, others from the neighborhood stepped out of their homes or paused during their afternoon walks. A delivery driver parked at the curb and lingered, holding his phone up halfway. A pair of teens on bikes stopped at the corner. Curious faces turned toward the front door, watching the red and blue lights bounce off the windows, trying to piece together what was happening. More than one phone was recording now, held just steady enough to catch whatever might unfold. From the inside hallway, Officer Noah Miller could see their faces through the front window. He noticed how some of the neighbors exchanged glances with raised brows, how others looked quietly disturbed, even angry. It was clear they recognized Linda. This wasn't some anonymous house in a bad part of town. It was a respected home in a safe neighborhood, and she was someone people knew. That realization made the knot in Miller's chest tighten. The longer he stood there, the heavier the air felt. The sounds from upstairs, drawers pulled open, something heavy dropped, a door creaking, echoed in his ears like warning bells. He glanced back at Linda, who now sat rigidly on the entryway bench, her phone clutched in one hand, her other hand trembling slightly against her lap. He remembered her from a city council meeting just 2 months earlier. She had spoken passionately about re-entry programs and the need for compassion in law enforcement. She had used terms like dignity and second chances. He hadn't agreed with everything she'd said then, but she had spoken with conviction. And now here she was, treated like a suspect in her own home, her belongings tossed aside like trash. Miller's throat felt dry. The badge on his chest suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He wasn't sure what Barnes was really looking for, but nothing about this felt right. And worst of all, he realized something that made his stomach turn. He was letting it happen. The low hum of a powerful engine cut through the street's stillness, and the crowd outside instinctively turned to look. A sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the curb, its arrival quiet but commanding. The driver stepped out quickly, scanned the scene, and moved to open the passenger door. From it emerged Ethan Prescott, tall and composed in a navy suit that fit him like it had been tailored that morning. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone shifted the energy on the block. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones lowered slightly. Even the wind seemed to pause. Ethan's pace was calm but deliberate. Each step up the walkway toward his house felt like a gavel striking wood. He didn't look around, didn't acknowledge the crowd, didn't blink. He just walked. Through the open front door, he saw his wife sitting near the entrance, her shoulders tense, eyes trained on the staircase. A lamp was knocked over beside her. A pile of books lay scattered on the floor. He stepped inside and gently touched her shoulder. She looked up at him, not panicked, but steady, and gave a slight nod. That was all he needed. Without removing his sunglasses, Ethan turned and called up the stairs, his voice low but clear. "This is Deputy Director Ethan Prescott. I need both officers in this house to come downstairs. Right now." The sound of movement above stopped for a beat. Then came a clumsy shuffle as someone descended. Barnes was the first to appear, holding the same file folder he'd tucked under his arm earlier. When he spotted Ethan standing in the entryway, the color drained from his face. He tried to adjust his stance, shifting into something more official, more controlled, but it was too late. "Sir," he started, voice stiff, "we were responding to a report regarding this property." "A tip about sensitive." Ethan raised one hand, cutting him off. He stepped in close, just enough that Barnes could see his jaw was clenched. "You entered my home without a warrant. You violated my wife's rights, and you did all of this while knowingly bypassing protocol." Barnes tried to speak again, but Ethan's voice dropped lower, quiet, cold, deliberate. "Don't spin this into procedure. I saw your name on a misconduct report 8 months ago. I let that warning stand. I gave you a chance to fix your course." His eyes narrowed slightly. "And now you've brought this mess to my door." For the first time, Barnes looked genuinely shaken. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Behind him, Officer Miller stood at the base of the stairs, not saying a word, his eyes downcast. Ethan turned to him. "Is there a legal reason this search was conducted?" Miller hesitated. A lump formed in his throat. He looked from Ethan to Linda and back again. His voice came out quieter than expected. "No, sir, I was following orders, but there was no warrant. Nothing official." That silence after his words was sharp, like the air had been cut in half. Outside, the crowd pressed in closer. Someone was still recording. Someone else gasped softly. Barnes took a step back, trying to regain footing in a situation quickly crumbling beneath him. But he already knew. There was no way out of this clean. Not anymore. Ethan looked between the two men. His next words were clear and final. "This ends here. Both of you, step outside." Barnes stood frozen, the file still clutched tightly in one hand, his other curled into a tense fist at his side. His mouth opened as if to argue, but he stopped himself, perhaps realizing that there was no way to spin this into something professional or defensible. The presence of Deputy Director Ethan Prescott made that impossible. Behind him, Miller didn't move at first. His feet felt cemented to the floor. But when Ethan took a single step closer and gestured toward the doorway, Miller finally shifted. With a glance at Barnes, half apology, half detachment, he moved past him and toward the porch. Barnes followed a few steps behind, slower, heavier. As they stepped outside, the buzz from the crowd swelled. Linda had risen now and stood near the doorway, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her voice was quiet but firm when she spoke. "They went through everything. My desk, my closet. They pulled down family photos." Ethan looked at her, his expression softening for a brief second. Then he turned to face the gathering crowd. The sidewalk was now filled with people. Neighbors, pedestrians, a few local reporters who must have caught wind through a scanner. Phones were still raised. The red and blue lights continued to flash behind the cruiser windshields, casting color across the faces watching intently. Ethan stepped outside, stood next to the two officers, and raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear. This afternoon, a search was conducted at this address without a legal warrant and without proper authorization. As Deputy Director of the FBI for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, I am placing Officer Troy Barnes on immediate suspension, pending an internal investigation. Officer Noah Miller will also be reassigned during the course of that review. A murmur spread through the crowd, some shocked, some affirming. Barnes shifted uncomfortably, clearly trying not to show how fast his heart was beating. Miller stood still, eyes lowered, trying to breathe through the storm he had just stepped into. But then, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he looked up, not at Ethan, not at Linda, but at the crowd. "I want to say something," he said, his voice tight. Ethan turned slightly, surprised but didn't stop him. Miller stepped forward, swallowing hard. "I went along with it," he admitted. "I knew we didn't have proper clearance. I didn't speak up inside the house, and I should have. That was wrong. I was wrong." The words hung in the air, surprisingly loud in their simplicity. The crowd went still for a moment. Some looked at him with raised eyebrows. Others surprisingly nodded. There was no applause, no cheering, but there was a shift, a quiet one, like something inside the mood had changed. Linda looked at him with tired but sincere eyes. For the first time all day, he felt like he had done one thing right. Ethan didn't speak for several seconds. Then he gave a small nod, not of approval but acknowledgement. He turned to the officer beside him. "Barnes, hand over that folder." The older officer hesitated, then reluctantly extended it. Ethan passed it to Linda without a word. She took it, her fingers brushing against his for just a moment, and held it against her chest. In that small gesture, something was restored. Not everything, but something. Enough to begin again. As the late afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the Prescott lawn, Ethan reached for his phone and made a single call to the Bureau's Internal Affairs Division. His voice was calm and clipped, each word carefully chosen. "I need a full incident team at my residence." 2 officers entered without a warrant. "Immediate suspension is in effect. I want digital forensics on all reports submitted this morning, and I want to know exactly who authorized their dispatch." He ended the call without further explanation, then turned to the growing crowd. His tone shifted, not just as a husband defending his wife, but as a federal officer defending the system from its own decay. This was not policing, this was a violation, and it will be treated as such. Barnes stood awkwardly off to the side now, no longer trying to maintain authority. A few people in the crowd recognized him and whispered. A local blogger was already narrating live into her phone, listing off what had happened, noting every detail. The pressure was building, and Barnes looked like a man trying to find an exit with none left open. Miller remained still, the weight of his earlier admission still settling on his shoulders. He hadn't redeemed himself. Not yet, but he had drawn a line. For now, that meant something. Ethan turned to Linda, his voice softening as he spoke only to her. "Let's get you inside. The team will handle everything from here." But she didn't move right away. Her eyes scanned the faces on the sidewalk, the concerned, the curious, the judgmental. Then she nodded once and walked toward the door. Her chin lifted just slightly higher than before. The damage inside her home could be cleaned. What mattered more was the quiet truth that had been brought to light. Behind them, the front door clicked shut, and Ethan stayed by the window, arms folded, eyes watching as the Internal Affairs vehicle pulled up quietly to the curb. The system had been shaken, but not broken, and now it had no choice but to answer. In the days that followed, the events at the Prescott home became the center of a growing storm. News outlets picked up the story quickly. First local channels, then national media. The headline ran on several networks. Deputy FBI Director's wife targeted in a legal search by local officers. Clips from bystanders' phone recordings were replayed over and over. Barnes pushing past Linda at the front door, the chaos inside the house, and most memorably, the moment Officer Miller stood on the porch and admitted they had no warrant. People didn't just watch it. They shared it, debated it, and demanded answers. The story struck a chord. It wasn't just about one home being violated. It was about power abused under the disguise of process, and how close that danger could come, even to people at the top. Ethan launched a full-scale internal review at the Bureau. Not only was Barnes placed on indefinite suspension, but investigators soon discovered he had manipulated prior reports in at least 2 other unrelated incidents, both involving individuals from reentry programs similar to the one Linda oversaw. It became clear that Barnes had harbored resentment toward the Prescotts since his prior disciplinary warning and had used an unverified tip as a weapon. That tip, traced back to a deliberately anonymous message, turned out to be unsubstantiated and submitted through a backdoor access point. It was an attempt to create just enough doubt to justify force, just enough to cover a vendetta. Officer Miller, for his part, was reassigned during the investigation, but not terminated. His admission on the scene, paired with a written report detailing the full timeline, became a crucial part of holding the misconduct accountable. When asked later in an interview why he had stepped forward, he simply said, "I was taught to serve the people, not protect a partner's pride." For Linda, the aftermath was bittersweet. Her home was cleaned and repaired within days, but the sense of safety took longer to return. Still, she remained active in her work, more than ever, in fact. The story gave her foundation unexpected visibility. Donations increased, volunteers signed up, and most importantly, the women she served saw, clearly, that even someone like her could be targeted and still stand tall. Her story reminded them they weren't alone, that dignity didn't come from who you were married to, but from how you carried yourself when everything was stripped away. On a quiet Friday morning, 2 weeks after the incident, Linda stood in front of a group of young women at a community center downtown. She shared what had happened, not for sympathy, but to show them what resolve looked like. "You don't fight back by screaming," she said, her voice steady. "You fight back by standing still, by knowing who you are, and by refusing to let someone else define that for you." Her words landed with weight. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his work at the Bureau with even more focus. Policies were reviewed, protocols tightened, and Barnes, once confident in his ability to operate without consequence, now faced formal charges of misconduct, falsifying official documents, and abuse of authority. The message was clear, both inside and outside the walls of law enforcement. Power doesn't excuse you from accountability. And silence, especially in the face of injustice, is no longer an option. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think twice about what real accountability looks like, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. There are more powerful, real-life stories just like this. Stories that challenge systems, uplift voices, and remind us all of the strength in standing firm. Don't miss the next one.